All right. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, as I am a convert. Technically, that's not the word we're supposed to use when a Protestant becomes Catholic, but they don't really have a better word for it, so I'm just going to leave it at that. I thought that it would be good to just kind of go over my general view of conversion and what the steps are and where we can be in that process for somebody, whether they are exiting the Catholic faith and we're trying to help them not, or whether they're coming in and maybe, probably having struggles. A lot of times people view conversion as kind of a ramp, like an on-ramp, that you're at point A and you just gradually become more and more and more like B until one day you're just B and you've moved from point A to point B. And that's what the conversion is. And while I suppose that that's possible as a model, I don't find it very helpful because although there are certainly ways we can think of conversion, especially religious conversion, as a gradual process, that view has a lot of difficulties with real experience, and I don't really think it helps us to see what's really happening there. And there are two major issues. Number one is that the conversion processes are rarely completely gradual. It's not just an accumulation of facts until you switch positions on something. And I'll explain why I think that in a minute, because I'm basically stealing this from somebody else. And the other issue is that it doesn't really get to the root cause of conversion, which a true conversion is not just going to be an exchange of particulars in a collection. It's not just going to be, well, I used to believe this list of things, and now I believe this list of things, and so now I'm moved from here to here. But there's a deeper conversion that takes place at what I'm going to call the paradigm level or the worldview level, that really sort of controls what particulars come into play. And if we think of conversion as just a gradual on-ramp and accumulation of facts or ideas, it can be very difficult to figure out what to do when really we're looking at different stages and we're looking at something a lot deeper than just an exchange of one particular collection of beliefs for another particular collection of beliefs. So the way I'm going to chart it out, it's going to look like this. And I have notes that I will send you, but if you're a note taker, feel free to draw this and then we'll fill it in as we go. But this model of conversion is what's called a paradigm revolution. And I got that from somebody else. So I'll explain as I go where this came from, but I found this very useful. I've kind of gone through two major religious conversions in my life, first from an agnostic to a Protestant evangelical Christian, and then from that to Catholic. And so I am able to reflect on this process a bit, and I have found this particular model to be really helpful. And what we're going to see is that although religious faithful often differ, obviously, in a lot of their particular beliefs, what's more important is what underlies those beliefs, and that is the paradigm. So let's define that. So a paradigm, you've probably heard the term paradigm shift. I mean, it gets used so often now, it's become kind of annoying. It's become kind of a business buzzword. But if you've ever used the phrase paradigm shift, you're actually taking that from a man named Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher of science. And he wrote this amazing book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it's a really fun book. If you're into history, if you're into science at all, this is an absolute must read. What Kuhn did in this book was he basically traced the history of scientific development and showed how this view that we have that scientists are all just these white-robed, intellectuals performing 100% on logic and just gradually building the knowledge base until we have reached this glorious place that we are today is really a complete myth. That's just not how science works. It's not how the major revolutions in science have worked. And so what Kuhn said was that the actual structure of these scientific discoveries were really more of a paradigm revolution, something where there was an entire scientific mindset that shifted dramatically from one complete worldview to a completely different worldview. And those don't happen gradually. You don't replace an entire underlying structure of your thought just because some particulars change. And that's what the whole book is about. It's just one story after another of these amazing discoveries that came about and how they came about. And while Kuhn doesn't really give like a step-by-step model, that's been kind of left to his readers to figure out. The steps that I'm going to go over are all mirrored to one extent or another by his book. So what is a paradigm? The paradigm is an underlying model of reality. And it's a worldview in the sense that it underlies everything, but it also kind of controls things. It determines what subjects are to be studied. It determines the kinds of questions and answers that are acceptable in that study, and how the evidence that is obtained is to be interpreted. And this is why, as we'll see, it's incredibly difficult to communicate with somebody who is operating under a different paradigm than you are, because you can throw all the evidence and arguments you want at them, but if they are interpreting the evidence and those arguments through a different paradigm than you are, it's going to have a very different effect. And this can be extremely frustrating because it makes you feel like the other person's stupid, or in Christian terms, sin. You're either a sinner or you're stupid, because this is like right here. I'm giving you this great evidence, these great arguments. Clearly, there's just something wrong with your brain, or else you would agree with me. But this is why recognizing those underlying issues, the paradigm that is controlling all of this, is so important. So I like this illustration here that, what we see of people are the particular beliefs that they hold. I believe there's a God. I believe Jesus died for my sins. I believe, homosexuality is a sin. That's our list. Okay, that's the list. But the list of particular beliefs is grounded by, and in some cases emerges from, the underlying paradigm, which we don't necessarily see unless we really do some hard work and get into the detection of that paradigm. Like, how is it that you're thinking? Maybe I know what you're thinking. We've talked long enough that I know what you think, but I don't know why you think that. And that is really where I believe conversion takes place. Conversion takes place at the level of the why. What is behind this belief? What's the principle behind that particular? And just to keep our language uniform, we're going to call that the paradigm. That's the thing that needs to change if somebody is going to go through a conversion. I'm not really watching for hands or anything, so I don't know if you can interrupt or do jumping jacks or something, but if there's a clarification question or something I said that doesn't make sense, or I skipped something, you can let me know. So changing paradigms requires not just a shift in beliefs, but a revolution in how somebody thinks. And especially I'm going to argue for the Catholic paradigm. I can tell you that going from Protestant to Catholic may not seem like that big of a shift, because it's kind of like, well, I mean, some Protestants' particular belief list looks a lot like the Catholic. I mean, some of them are just, one belief away, from appearing Catholic. Somebody like C.S. Lewis, who he affirmed purgatory. He was okay with evolution. He believed that people could be saved, outside of a strict preaching of the gospel. I mean, all this stuff that the church taught, but he just didn't like the Pope. And if he just could have gotten it, but that doesn't make him 95% Catholic. Well, I'll get to that, but there's another step that has to happen before you're thinking truly as a Catholic. And if you don't have that Catholic paradigm, you're not really Catholic, whether you believe all the Catholic things or not. So I think it's important for us to notice that as well. So I mentioned these arguments. So here are two different paradigms, right? We have round Earth, flat Earth, right? I don't know if you have seen this, but there are actually like people in the world that actually believe the world is flat. They still think so. They have conventions. I mean, it's crazy, right? So I looked up some of their arguments. And you see things like, well, the horizon appears flat. I mean, how do you account for that if we're on a ball? If the world is really a spinning ball, why are we not all flying off of it? How come the stars don't seem to change position while the Earth is spinning? If the sun was really as far away as it is, the beams should all seem to fall parallel on the planet and not fan out. And, just looking at these, like, even the ones that I didn't have a good answer for still seem stupid. Right? Like, that's clearly a dumb argument because your conclusion is dumb. And I already know that. So there's a sense in which even the arguments that right away I couldn't give an account for didn't really move me very far toward accepting the flat earth because it's just so clearly wrong. There's an answer out there somewhere. I'll figure it out, blah, blah, blah. Right. And I think most of us are like that. And, if you're kind of on the edge of the flat earth view, then think of something else as an example. Converting to Islam, I think for most of us, converting to Islam you just can't even imagine what it would take to go from here to there. Like, how could I ever end up thinking like those people? So even if you get an argument that you go, I don't really know the answer to that, your initial reaction is probably not going to be, well, I guess I'll become Muslim, guess the earth is flat. I don't know the answer to that. And there's a reason that you feel that way. And it's because of where you are in the conversion process. Whereas some people, that have gone all the way through it are going to look at you like, well, you're an idiot. You can't answer my argument, but you're not changing your mind. So you're just not being logical. Well, no, they're just in a different place in the process. So this process becomes really important to look at. All right, so I'm going to fill in my little chart here. And this is not all Kuhn's terminology. I'm actually stealing from two people, so that makes it research. You steal from one person, it's plagiarism. If you steal from two or more, it's research. Another great book, if you have somebody who is considering the Catholic Church or is Catholic and is considering the Protestant Church, this is a brilliant book by the sociologist Christian Smith. He's also a convert. And he wrote several really good books on his way into the church that I read at the same time I was kind of going through my thing. The title is horrible. It's called How to Go from Being a Good Evangelical to a Committed Catholic in 95 Difficult Steps. Did you get that? I'll put it in the notes. I don't know what editor let this horrible title slip through. Maybe it's self-published. I don't know. But what he does is he applies Thomas Kuhn's view of scientific revolutions to religious conversion. And it's great because every chapter is another step, and he kind of shows you like, this is what's happening. It's almost written for someone who knows somebody who's becoming Catholic, and he's kind of trying to explain what's going on with them. Really cool. But this particular chart, these are just the words I made up. I like things that rhyme and have the same letters because I used to be Baptist. So that's the way we do things. So in the process of a paradigm revolution, we begin in a state called stasis. And this is a time of stability. This is a time where our current model or our current paradigm of reality has been successful. It's answering questions. It's making sense out of the input that I'm getting. The evidence that I see for my faith or whatever else fits very neatly into my model of how I understand reality. Progress is being made, okay? Like within my paradigm, I'm gaining, I'm learning more and more, and I'm getting deeper and deeper and stronger in my beliefs. And at this stage, really any other paradigm is kind of off the table. We're deeply involved. We really don't have any good reason to even consider that the paradigm doesn't work because it is working. It's working just fine, and nothing has come up against it that I can't deal with. So we're completely content. And this is, probably where a lot of you are. You're Dominicans. You've probably been Catholic for a number of years. And the reason you're Dominican is because you're trying to go deeper into the faith. You're not really in that trying to figure out if it's true or not stage. You're really kind of settled on that question. And now you're just trying to get more and more and more. So stasis is where most people are when they are not going through anything. Okay. They're just there. And this can last an entire lifetime. And that's fine, because maybe you just start off with the right paradigm and you never have to lose it. But if somebody is going to be dislodged from this state, we need to move on to why. So this is the next arrow here is, and this is Thomas Kuhn. He calls these aberrations. So an aberration is something that seems to go wrong. It's something that the paradigm doesn't sit well with. Maybe it is unexplainable. There's something that has happened, or an argument that I've been given that I realize, like, I really can't deal with this on my current paradigm. There's something going on here, and it's not working. And so when our expectations are kind of violated that way, it can be kind of disturbing. Some apologists call it a rock in the shoe. It's just this irritating thing in the back of your mind that won't go away. And if you're going to remain in your paradigm, you have to do something about this. as these aberrations pile up, if they do, like let's say you start to investigate this one aberration and then you discover there are more, you can go into the next stage, which is called drift. And drift occurs when these aberrations start to seriously weaken the worldview or the paradigm. It starts to kind of, I sort of picture it like, you've had this boat that's been tied securely to, the shore, and it's starting to kind of go away a little bit, and you're starting to feel kind of weird because this has never happened. And suddenly, that dock is looking a little farther away than you wish it was. Maybe the rope is still connected, but it's like way out there and it's going to be kind of hard to get back. At this point, if you really actually start to drift out of the paradigm, something's going to have to happen to bring you back. And often at this stage, if it is a true aberration, something that the paradigm cannot deal with, then you start to respond with what I'm calling alterations. And this is basically tweaking the paradigm in order to absorb those aberrations and deal with them. So for example, this is where, and I'm going to be going off of my conversion into the church, but this is where a lot of evangelicals become Anglican. Okay. It's like, okay, I've got some real serious problems. Evangelicalism has not been able to answer it. I've kind of drifted away. I don't really even know if I'm evangelical anymore. But I don't really know where I'm going, but hey, Anglicanism, right? This answers a lot of the problems I'm having. So I can just hang out here for a while. And so this isn't really like a paradigm shift. It's more like I've just altered it. I'm still thinking the way an evangelical thinks, but now I have candles and robes and, all that cool stuff that I wanted. But let's say these alterations don't cut it. Okay. It worked for a little while, but those aberrations are not going away. Maybe you've discovered other ones. Maybe you've discovered that the alterations you've made don't really answer the aberrations. If this happens, then you go into what's called crisis. Crisis is reached when you just cannot modify the paradigm enough to resolve those aberrations, those anomalies. And so you're going to have to basically look for something else. And this is why it's called a crisis, because now you don't know where you're going, but you know where you're not going to go back to. I'm just not going to be able to stay in the previous paradigm, but I don't know what is coming next. And so then you basically start kind of playing around with some other paradigms. And you try to find some resolutions. Resolutions are kind of experimental models that take care of those aberrations, but you're not really in a new paradigm yet because you're basically just kind of finding the building blocks for answering those aberrations. What would a paradigm look like that doesn't give up any of the things that are good from the previous one, but also eliminates those things that are causing me problems? And if those aberrations are really resolved, and you can preserve what was from the previous paradigm, then you are probably going to enter into the shift. And so the paradigm shift is where you've basically said, I have a new model now that's out there. It seems to explain everything that the old model did, but it also doesn't suffer from the aberrations that the old model did. So I at least have one now. On paper, this looks good. So this is an overthrow. Okay, this is not a modification of the previous paradigm, but this is the accepting of a brand new one. I'm shifting. I'm exchanging one paradigm for another. However, we're not quite there yet, because during this phase, one more thing has to happen, and this is usually met with a lot of resistance. So usually right kind of toward the end of a paradigm shift, you would think that this would happen in crisis, but this is really where the panic often sets in. Like, am I really going to do this? Am I really going to become a flat earther? Am I really going to become a Muslim? And all of a sudden, any weakness in the new paradigm starts to flare up. Like, in fact, you almost kind of want it to, because you're still kind of looking for an excuse to not do this. Resistance is often accompanied by the refusal to admit that the old paradigm was really actually flawed, or that this one's better. But the cool thing about this point is that by now, you've probably adopted the new paradigm to the extent that you can think in both worlds. So I can still think very much like my old paradigm, but I've also been involved in the new one enough that I can kind of think like that. And now I'm actually able to more securely weigh both sides. And this is where things get really weird, because this is where things like jargon come into play. You know, you've learned a bunch of new words, or you're learning how a different group uses those words. You're starting to understand why the two sides can't talk to each other very well, because, wow, there's some fundamental differences. Because remember, this is a paradigm shift. This isn't just, you know, evangelical church on this side of the street and the evangelical church on the other side of the street. You know, this is a radical upheaval of the way you see the whole world. And so for a time, at least, you've got that sort of bridge where you're not on either side yet. You're sort of on the bridge. You're maybe one step away from stepping off that bridge, but you're really able to see both sides. And if the competing paradigm eventually satisfies you, and the aberrations are really actually gone, and there's really no going back, then you're probably going to go ahead and complete the process, which means that you come back into stasis again. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're like completely comfortable or happy. It just means that, yeah, I'm this now. It may be embarrassing. There may be a lot of practical issues, but you have effectively changed your paradigm. You don't think like you used to, even if you can remember how. So what's interesting here is that Kuhn describes this as a scientific phenomenon, right? I mean, that's the name of the book. This is something that allegedly, you know, the most objective, intellectual, logical people in the world go through. And again, he gives chapter after chapter, example after example of how science is really moved forward, and that it's not just this gradual accumulation of knowledge based on the scientific method. So you can imagine that if this paradigm shift model is true of science, imagine how much more it affects a religious person, right? Because most people don't approach their faith scientifically, in the sense that it's not all intellect, it's not all arguments and that kind of thing. It's not just evidence. So religious conversion can be a very big deal, because I think it affects the whole person in a way that maybe pure science doesn't. We're not just intellect. We have a will, we have passions, we have all these other things that make us human. And so while we're really just kind of looking at the intellectual side right now, we need to realize that this is a whole person affect that's happening here. It can be incredibly emotional. It can be very willful. People can just maybe not like something. I don't care if you have the right arguments. I don't like where this is headed. It can be very, very difficult. But it's also important to realize that where somebody is in the process really makes a big difference as to how our approach to them changes. Because somebody who is in the early stages is thinking in a completely different way than someone that's in the later stages. I remember when one of the first converts, one of the guys that tells his story in here, Jeremiah Cowart, a friend of mine from the seminary, became Catholic. We had all these arguments, and he told me I needed to read this Scott Hahn guy. So I read Rome Sweet Home, and I wasn't impressed. I mean, the guy knows his stuff, obviously, but it didn't really bother me very much at all. Well, it was funny because years later, as I was kind of sliding into home base and becoming Catholic, I thought, I really knew who Scott was at this point, and I was like, gosh, I wonder why Rome Sweet Home didn't affect me. I mean, I must not have read it very carefully. I must have just blown through that book, because there's no way that someone like him was not convincing. So I grabbed my copy off the shelf and started flipping through it. Well, I had highlighted, I had underlined, and this is a picture of my book. I actually made an index in the back. Okay. I mean, I treated this book like it was an assignment in grad school, and yet I came away with nothing. I mean, I couldn't tell you a single argument he had made. My heart was not moved one bit by this book, but I had obviously really studied it. But again, at the time, I was in stasis mode. I was evangelical. Everything was cool. Catholics were obviously crazy idolaters. And it just had no effect on me, even though I, totally took this thing apart. The second time I read Rome Sweet Home, I thought Scott had been reading my blog. Oh, he knows all these arguments, and so what's hilarious is that I'm sitting here trying to convince my evangelical friends that there's this huge problem, and I'm giving them the arguments that Scott Hahn gave in his book, and they're not being moved by them. They're like, oh, whatever, who cares if we're not the church that built the Bible? Who cares if we can't all agree with each other? But now I saw these as big, huge problems, right? Because now I'm kind of more in like crisis mode. I'm trying to resolve these problems, and my evangelical friends didn't even see them as problems. But it's good to remember that I was there too. There was a time where I could get all the way through Scott Hahn's book and not feel any pressure to become Catholic. It's just I was in a different part of the process. So I mentioned earlier that there's a Catholic faith paradigm. And I think that it's important to actually like very explicitly point this out, because it's something that I don't think a lot of Catholics get. It took me a long time to figure this out. But the Catholic faith paradigm is that faith is not just an assent to some statement. It's not just belief in something, because you can believe for different reasons. You might believe something because someone told you once and you just never investigated it yourself. You could believe it because it's attractive. You could, but for the Catholic, faith is a different thing. It's a different kind of thing than a belief, because it's an act of the will. It's a willful submission to religious authority. It's not just agreement with a set of beliefs. And a big part of how that's different in conversion is that, unlike, say, a Protestant church where, going from this church on this side of the street to going to the other church on the other side of the street is maybe just agreeing to a different list, the Catholic Church wants to know why you believe that list. Because if you only believe it because you happen to like it, if you only believe it because that's how you were raised, in fact, even if you were argued into it and you just don't have a good answer to the arguments, none of those are faith to the Catholic Church. What Catholicism teaches is that faith is when you willfully submit to the church. And that's a completely different view than the Protestant view, or even almost any non-Catholic view. Most worldviews don't care how you arrived at your worldview. They don't care where the paradigm came from. And so what I'm calling a belief paradigm is that the belief of the content is what's paramount. Can you check off every one of these statements that we make of doctrine? If yes, then you can be yes. You can be Presbyterian, you can be Methodist, you can be evangelical. But it never says why. Like, never in these does it say, oh, and by the way, the reason you believe these things has to be because the church teaches it, where that is what the Catholic Church teaches. So unfortunately, there's a lot of Catholics that think like Protestants. They're Catholic because they happen to believe these things. They're Catholic because they like these things. They're Catholic because they were raised with these things. But according to the church, that's not faith. That's a belief, and those are different. So that paradigm shift was huge for me, especially because I was used to arguing through every point of doctrine. I was used to saying, here's the Bible, and here's my arguments, and whoever gives the best arguments wins. And then now you're a good faithful believer. So you can see the difference. Like, it would be one thing to say, okay, Protestant, here's 35 things you believe as a Protestant, here's 35 things you believe as a Catholic. If you can check these boxes instead of these boxes, well, then you can be Catholic. But that's not a paradigm shift. That's just the particulars changing around. And that's why there are some Protestants that believe almost everything the Catholic Church teaches, and there's some Protestants that believe almost nothing the Catholic Church teaches, because it's just a list, and it's not based on any authoritative body that has to be followed. So it's not just the list that changes, the particulars, but it's also the paradigm when somebody actually becomes Catholic. Okay, so let's get to your place in the process. All right, so looking at, and by the way, this is where you might want to start superimposing any particular paradigm shift that you're concerned about in. Okay, stasis may be the Catholic. Okay, this might be your brother who's been Catholic his whole life and now is seeming to leave the church. So this process isn't a good or a bad thing. I've been presenting it as if it's, kind of my story coming into the church, like, oh, yay, it happened, but this can be a deconversion too, right? This could be someone that was Catholic their whole life, and now they're leaving the church. So the stage is not positive or negative. It's just what it is. It's just how people convert. So feel free to superimpose your own situations, if there are any, onto this. So back to stasis, right? So in stasis, we can tell somebody is in this stage because they're basically happy with where they are. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily joyful all the time, but they have a settled view. They're comfortable. They're stable. They're probably unaware of any major issues with their view. Or they may know that there are some, but they're comfortable living with it. It's just not really bugging them very much at the time. And so any other worldview at this point is really off the table. Okay, so this is where most of us are with becoming flat earthers or becoming Muslim. Like, it's just, I don't even know what it would take to get me to switch positions on this. But I'm not even really willing to look into it because it's just not even on the table for consideration. So depending on what we're trying to do here, if somebody is in stasis in a view that we think is false, like let's say this is a high school friend, you were both in Catholic everything together up until high school, you moved apart, it's 30 years later, and you've discovered, oh my gosh, they've become an atheist. Okay, so this might be that kind of situation. So if you are trying to move somebody, if you're trying to help them get into this process, then what you're actually needing to do is to create aberrations for them. And a good way to do that is basically to ask leading questions. And by leading questions, what I mean is these are questions that you already know their paradigm is going to have a difficult time dealing with. Okay, so if it's an atheist, you can ask them something like, well, where do you think all of this stuff came from? Do you think you're just molecules? And this is where some apologetic knowledge comes in. We're not going to go into that here. We can do another class on that if you want to, but there are a few simple stages that take you kind of from ground zero to Catholicism. Okay, basically, do we know truth? Does reality exist? Does reality say that God exists? And if God exists, has he verified a particular religion in a way that we can recognize? If you know the arguments for those stages, you can basically just kind of pick wherever that person isn't yet and start asking them questions. For me, when I was in stasis as an evangelical, the kinds of questions that I got asked were things like, where did the New Testament come from? How do you know it's those 27 books and not another? The more I looked into that, the more I realized that without the church, you don't really have a good answer to that question. But again, in stasis, I didn't think about it because every Bible I had, I'm reaching around like I have one here. I do have a Bible, I promise. There we go. It all came with the same 27 books. So who cares? I mean, however it happened, whatever, let's go, let's go hiking. But for whatever reason, eventually those questions bugged me enough that they became aberrations. There's something about being evangelical is causing me a problem because it can't account for the Bible I have in my hand. And yet it says that the Bible I have in my hand is the only thing I need to be faithful to God. That's really weird. How come you say a Jehovah's Witness is not a Christian, Mormon's not a Christian, but a charismatic, Pentecostal is? Oh, those kinds of questions created aberrations for me. And so, this may require some study. If somebody is in a place that you don't know very much about, you're probably going to have to look into it a little bit. You're going to have to find those holes, find those problems, especially the ones that your paradigm can deal with. Okay, like a Catholic asking an evangelical, where'd you get your Bible, is a pretty safe question because the Catholic can actually know that. We actually have, an answer to where the Bible came from. Now, if somebody is in the drift stage, so let's say the aberrations are working on them and they're in the drift stage, this person has become uncomfortable with those issues. And I think that's really the difference between the two stages, is that in stasis, they don't really care. They don't know and they don't care. In the drift stage, they don't know, but now they do care. This is really starting to bother them. But they're probably still fairly confident that they can be answered. It's like, yeah, that the canon, yeah, that's a problem, but I'm going to find the answer. And this is where I was in grad school. I was literally writing like papers for in my PhD program on where the canon came from and how we determine orthodoxy. And I was having a real hard time getting those answers. I really thought they were going to be there. And this is where guidance comes in. So as far as our role, guidance can be very helpful. So for me, for example, this is where a guy named Devin Rose became really important in my conversion experience, because Devin himself was a convert. We'd both written a book, and he was commenting on my website and stuff. And we ended up being very good friends. In fact, he was my sponsor for RCIA. But his guidance was great, because he would encourage me. Yeah, you're right. That's a good question. You really need to answer that, don't you? And then anytime I got the answer a little more right, oh yeah, that's right, Doug. It is the church. So he wasn't like actively proselytizing me. He wasn't giving me arguments against evangelicalism or showing me how stupid it was or anything like that. Rather, it was just more of an encouragement that, yes, you're in the right direction. Good job. You found the answer to that question. And so that just helps strengthen me into moving into the next step. So what you're looking for here are the alterations, right? So this is the alteration stage. The guidance kind of helps show somebody, no, that's not really going to work. It's like, yep, I'm really